Welcome, everybody, to the National Research Collaborative for Foster Alumni in Higher Education webinar series. My name is Jenna Thompson. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a PhD candidate at Washington State University, working in the foster care research lab. If you or somebody else that you know has an interest in speaking in the future, presenting at one of these webinars, please contact Dr. Amy Salazar. I'll drop her name and information into the chat in a minute here. This webinar will also be recorded and available through the NRC FAHE website and their YouTube channel. I'll also drop that into the chat as well too, in case that is not the way that you found yourself here today. Um, you are welcome to turn on closed captioning if you would like to see the live transcript options in your Zoom menu. We'll have some time at the end of the discussion today for some Q&A, so feel free to type your questions into the chat or the Q&A box throughout the presentation. And at the end, if you want to come off and unmute to ask any questions or make comments, feel free to do so. Just keep in mind that if you wish to have your camera on or unmute, that this webinar is being recorded. So today we have the pleasure of having with us Terrell Richardson. He's a PhD candidate at the University of Alabama School of Social Work, whose area of interest is college student mental health, substance use, and academic achievement, and the role of social workers in higher education. So with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Terrell, and thank you so much, everybody, for being here.
Thanks, Jenna. Uh, is everyone able to hear me? Can everyone hear me? Okay.
Yes, you sound great.
Okay, good. So I'm thankful for this opportunity today to present to you all findings from our systematic review that I conducted along with two colleagues, Dr. Crystal Dozier. She's an assistant professor at the University of North Alabama, and Dr. Sabrina Jackson, who is the dean at the Whitney M. Young School of Social Work at Clark Atlanta University in Atlanta. And so today's presentation, I'd like to entitle it What Works in Pre-College Programs for Foster Youth? And it's, again, evidence from our systematic review. And before moving forward, I want to say that even though the title says what works, and we'll talk about this throughout the presentation, that some of the limitations of our systematic review was just the methods that these studies used. So we'll talk about program characteristics that they offer, and then we'll spend a lot of time talking about the outcomes of participants who participated in these pre-college programs. And then I want to spend a good amount of time talking about how do we move forward. So, how I envision this presentation going today, I'll talk a little bit about me. We'll talk about the objectives for today's presentation, the motivation for this work. And I know that many people here may be familiar with just the current trends around youth with lived experiences in foster care in higher education. But just in case there are some folks here who are not familiar, want to provide some relevant statistics for that, and then as well as a brief overview of what are pre-college programs. Then we'll move right into the study, our systematic review, talking about those research aims, the methods, and then the findings, and again, spending a significant amount of time looking at the key takeaways and the implications of our study for policy practice and research. And then ending with a discussion on where do we go from here so we can make an impact together. So, as Jenna mentioned, I am a PhD candidate at the University of Alabama School of Social Work, and I am in my fourth year and also navigating the job market process and completing my dissertation. So, it's a very exciting and busy time for me. I have earned a Master's of Education in Student Affairs Administration from UNC Greensboro, a Master of Social Work from the Joint Master of Social Work program at North Carolina A&T and UNC Greensboro as well. And that kind of really situates my work at the intersection of education, particularly higher education and social work. And lastly, I got a Bachelor of Social Work from Livingstone College. One of the things that I'd like to say that I'm most proud of is just being a first generation college student. And I think this really intersects with the work that I aim to do and how I tend to use an anti-deficit strength-based approach in my work. And it's something that I'm certainly proud of. And if there are any other first generation students on the call or first generation graduates, that is something to be proud of. I think I just saw a statistic last week that only like 26 either 26 or 28% of first generation students will go on to college. So it's something to be proud of. And a part of my story and to how I started doing this work, looking at social work and higher education, it really stems from my experience from underperforming in high school. And it was something that I felt like I used to be uh, largely embarrassed by. I graduated with a 2.14 GPA and the last in my class, and college really didn't seem like an option for me. But due to some supports that I had, I was able to get into one college, and that was a small liberal arts college in North Carolina called Livingstone College. And when I went there, it just really transformed my educational trajectory. And it's one of the things I think that Jelani Favors talks about in his book, Shelter in the Time of Storm. Humanitas is the term that he uses. And it's essentially the second curriculum that goes on at minority serving institutions, particularly historically Black colleges, and I was a beneficiary of that. And similar to what Jenna shared, my research looks at behavioral health among emerging adults navigating educational transitions, particularly Black college students, first generation students, and former and transition age foster youth, although significant, much of my work has focused on Black college students. So, the objectives for today, the first objective is to explain why foster youth and youth with lived experience in foster care in higher education represent a critical population for research and intervention. I like to refer to them as a high priority population that we should be investigating on college campuses right now. Another objective is we're going to describe the key programmatic features that distinguish pre-college interventions for foster youth from other pre-college programs that are designed just for the general population. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the findings. And lastly, just provide some documented outcomes and an evidence base for pre-college program participation among foster youth and alumni. At any point that I'm moving too fast, please feel free to come off mute and say slow down. I was supposed to have a co-presenter here today, and unfortunately, there was a scheduling conflict. So we're going to go through this today. So moving forward to the motivation for this work, it really started out of a GRA assignment that I had with one of the co-authors, Dr. Sabrina Jackson. Again, she's the dean at Clark Atlanta University, and she also founded and runs the National Social Work Enrichment Program. And it is a pre-college initiative designed to help foster youth graduate high school, pursue higher education, and explore social work as a career. And the three of us came together and wanted to conduct a systematic review from a perspective of wanting to know what works in pre-college programs and what are the outcomes of youth who have participated in these programs, kind of to build the evidence on why we need to continue to expand these pre-college programs that are specifically tailored for transition age foster youth and youth with lived experience in foster care. So, one of the statistics that I want to talk about today, and I'm sure a lot of you may be familiar here with this statistic, is that around 3 to 4% of former foster youth will obtain a 4-year college degree. And then next to that, between 2 and 6% will receive a 2-year degree. So going to a community college. And this is something that's important, especially when we think about why we should continue to study this population and why we should study higher education outcomes. So foster youth or youth with lived experiences in foster care, they face unique challenges such as childhood trauma, maybe have limited supports, and educational instability that may threaten their enrollment, retention, and persistence. And this is important because they are a unique population. And many times when we look at the literature and folks are conducting research on high priority populations, they tend to look at the deficits, but we don't look at the structural or the institutional barriers that kind of facilitate these barriers or these outcomes that these high priority populations are facing. And the next thing is that former foster youth face challenges in employment. And we know that higher education is one of the necessary things needed for an individual to increase their income, also to enter into the workforce. There's some research that talks about how individuals who have college degrees are likely to enter into jobs that pay higher wages. And also, there's some research from the Institute for Research and Policy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison that highlights how 1/3 of former foster youth will experience a disconnection from employment and education. And one study found that a little less than half were employed by age 25 to 26. And that's in comparison to about 70% of their peers who had not been in foster care. And I look at, from my perspective, that education is one of the ways that we can contribute to increasing those outcomes or improving outcomes for youth with lived experiences in foster care. And lastly, how I approach my work is that education is a social determinant of health and economic mobility. There's a lot of literature highlighting how individuals who pursue higher education and graduate with a credential are likely to have a longer lifespan, to also have improved health outcomes, and also be able to contribute to the economy while also improving their SES. And I think this is critically important for this population. And so, moving on to just what pre-college programs are for foster youth, it is a strategy to improve college readiness and preparation. And a paper from Dr. Jackson that she published in 2022 with her colleagues kind of emphasize the importance of having pre-college programs because they do prepare underserved or underrepresented students in higher education for pursuing higher education. And then they also have a dual component as reduce. They are one of the tactics or strategies to reduce these educational disparities that we see in society across racial groups. And then lastly, for our systematic review, and I'll repeat this again later on, is that we define pre-college programs based off of the definitions that are in the literature as interventions and initiatives that are designed to prepare students in K through 12 education for higher education. And so the research aim of our systematic review, the research aims were to identify the features of pre-college programs and the outcomes reported by youth in foster care who had participated in these pre-college programs. And our second aim was to highlight the need for the expansion of pre-college programs for foster youth across the United States. And we accomplished aim two by aiming to discover the individual and societal level benefits of expanding such programs in communities and higher education campuses. And we talked about that in our implication section. And for those of you who haven't had the opportunity to get access to our paper, it's available at the Journal of Child and Adolescent Social Work. And I'm happy to share that article with you if you don't have access to that. So, moving forward to our methods, we did our search in two phases. Our first search was conducted between July and August 2023, and then we did an updated search in July of 2025. And that updated search, again, we looked at peer-reviewed articles, but we also included great literature search during this second search. And one of the things is that our systematic review provides a really unique contribution to examining the outcomes of pre-college programs, specifically designed for youth with foster care experiences. And that is a huge gap in the literature. And so our systematic review aims to fill that gap in the literature. And these were some of the keywords that we used in our search for this systematic review. And so we also included grade literature in our review because of the feedback that we received, but it also gave us access to get at program evaluation reports because we realized that much of the work that happens outside of traditional academic publishing, for instance, a lot of our grade literature or the reports that we found came from nonprofits and foundations that are actually doing the work with foster youth. And so moving to the methods is in our initial search, there were 722 articles initially, and we narrowed it down to five peer-reviewed articles. And myself and the second author on the paper were responsible for reading those articles. And then our third author, which was Dr. Jackson, was responsible if there was any disagreement for solving that. And the next thing is we did a secondary search again, as I mentioned, in July of 2024, and we found 79 articles, and then we added one additional peer review article based off of that search. But then within the gray literature, we found six reports that were met the inclusion criteria for our study. And so the inclusion criteria for those studies to be included in our systematic review was foremost, they had to be written in English, focus on the United States-based programs, provide an overview of the program and reported participants' outcomes. And the overview of the programs that we were seeking to get information on was related to recruitment, staffing, duration, and/or length, along with some other topics. And we excluded studies that focused on campus-based support programs without a pre-college component and articles focusing on youth in foster care who are in college that did not mention the utilization of pre-college programs. And we also excluded studies that talked about pre-college programs that were not designed exclusively for foster youth. So moving on to our findings, and very happy to share those today. Is this is just at the map of where the studies were included in our study. And one of the things I want to go through and just list the programs that were included in our study. It was the Massachusetts Adolescent Outreach Program for Youth, which is located in Massachusetts. The First Star program, which is a part of the First Star Academy, which has multi-sites which are located in California and Arizona. The LifeSet program, which is based out of Illinois. We included a report from the Washington State Institute for Public Policy, of course, which is located in Washington. The Foster Youth Pre-College Collective Program out of California. The FAME program, the Fostering Academics Mentoring Excellence Program out of Michigan. The Better Futures program out of Oregon. The Bridging Success Early Start program, which is out of Arizona, and the Michigan Educational Opportunities for Youth and Care program based in Michigan. And lastly, the Fostering Higher Education Intervention, which is based out of Washington, which Dr. Salazar kind of led that study. And so, moving on to program characteristics, we've found remarkable diversity in how these programs operate, but yet they share common components or elements that are focused on educational transitions. So, for instance, going to the setting, the community-based programs, such as the Massachusetts Adolescent Outreach Program, was housed within a state welfare agency. According to the time of the report, they had around 194 teens paired with outreach workers, and that program provided them with weekly individualized support within the child welfare system. And it prepared them for more than just higher education, but also prepared them for or provided them education focused on getting them set up for tuition waivers to aid in their success transitioning to higher education. And that tuition waiver, I believe, provided them a $6,000 a year for them to pay for tuition, and then a $5,000 grant to be able to support those other associated costs with enrolling into higher education. But then on the other end, we had many of the studies included in our review were campus-based programs. And for instance, like the Fostering Academic Mentoring Excellence Program, which is FAME, They were housed on a college campus, and most of the programming took place on a college campus. And it operated more like a traditional pre-college program. And the focus of this program was on college preparation, financial literacy, and life skills in the academic setting, compared to many pre-college programs that just focused on just preparing for the academics associated with enrolling into higher education. So, moving to the duration, we saw three common themes in our systematic review about the duration, and that was summer residency with ongoing support, and ongoing transition support. And the summer residency support, the summer residency programs range from 3 to 6 day residency programs. And these programs could be considered similar to like a bridge program or a prep or exposure program, which are held on college campuses. For instance, the Michigan Education Opportunities for Youth and in foster care was a summer camp, and it offered shorter, intensive formats focused on supporting the transition into higher education. And then the programs that were the summer residency with ongoing support provided that summer residency component similar to like the bridge program, but it also maintained the relationship with the participants by providing either ongoing mentorship or professional development opportunities throughout the year. For instance, with the First Star program in California and Arizona, they held a summer residency and sponsored a monthly workshop throughout the academic year. And they credit that a lot to that is why they've had a lot of success to individuals going into college or enrolling in post-secondary education in their program. And then for the ongoing and transition support, it's the mission of really helping the youth develop independent living skills that are necessary for transitioning into adulthood. So we can see that really the summer residency with ongoing support and those ongoing programs really had a huge emphasis on preparing them for life associated with attending higher education outside of just preparing for the academics. So the staffing, similar to a traditional pre-college program, many of the programs hired university staff and faculty. But one of the unique things about these programs that are designed for either foster youth or youth with lived experiences in foster care is that some of them employed foster care alumni to serve as peers. And one thing to note is that they had different names for hiring these peers, or one study called them Foster Club All-Stars. And many of them were either youth who had experienced mental health challenges or youth who had experienced intersectional challenges similar to foster youth. And so programs that hired students that were foster care alumni or who had adjacent experiences, they provided coaching, mentorship to students. And we observed from our review that many of these programs reported that hiring these foster care alumni aided in the motivation or inspiration for participants. And many of the participants reported in these studies talking about how that was the first time that they had met another youth with lived experience in foster care attend college. And then, as I mentioned early on, that one of the programs hired caseworkers to be able to provide that support to the youth who were enrolled in these programs. So, moving forward to the outcomes, and before I get started on talking about the outcomes, it's important to note that many of the studies that were included in our systematic review did not use comparison groups, or they lacked the rigorous evaluation as far as using those comparison groups. And so this really prevents our ability to draw conclusions about the causal impacts of pre-college programs. And that's just something important to note as we talk about the outcomes of these pre-college programs. And so one of the things that we saw was that was reported in many of our studies is that for those who did have a comparison group, that it was higher enrollment among participants than non-participants who were receiving the intervention. And then secondly, many of the participants in the pre-college programs did go on to enroll into post-secondary education. So, to give you a diagram of how these program characteristics led to or contributed to participants enrolling into post-secondary education, I'll talk about a few of our studies that we included in our review. So, for the Massachusetts Adolescent Outreach Program, one of the primary factors that contributed to higher enrollment among participants compared to non-participants was due to the intensive personalized support that participants receive, despite many of their participants in the program experiencing multiple placement disruptions and limited familial supports, which has been identified as a huge risk factor for post-secondary enrollment. For the FAME program, the Fostering Academics and Mentoring Excellence program out of Michigan, their review reported that around 142 participants, they had 142 participants in their study, that 42% of their participants enrolled into higher education. And they attributed the high enrollment due to their program's emphasis on providing participants with building those practical skills necessary for success in higher education, such as navigating the hidden curriculum with enrolling in higher education. And that hidden curriculum could be applying for the FAFSA, paying for college, managing their time, and also having a competitive college application. Another program, the First Star program, emphasized that their program provided participants with specialized programming that addressed the wide range of factors that influence post-secondary enrollment, specifically for youth with lived experiences in foster care, such as academic preparation, life skills, and providing them the opportunity to build out their support system. And particularly, these are the things that First Star highlighted that foster care alumni need to support their success in higher education. And so, thinking about the funnel there, or the ball that's in that funnel that talks about support networks, I believe it was the LifeSet program that talked about that the case managers were focused on providing meaningful support. So, as they entered into higher education, they could rely on that case manager. And again, from many of the studies that were included in our review, it appears that the common theme was changing behaviors and building relationships for youth played a huge role in post-secondary enrollment. And I would like to say that the relationships and changing those behaviors could be linked to the motivation. And so really motivation was the main or key component that led to post-secondary employment. I mean, post-secondary enrollment. So again, it's important for us to focus on these educational outcomes, given that there is evidence highlighting an enduring history of academic underperformance, particularly among foster care alumni. But there's also a gap in policy and practice within the child welfare system that focuses on educational outcomes for foster youth or those that are in care. And again, remember early on in the PowerPoint, I talked about how higher education is one of those key vehicles for upward mobility and one of those social determinants for economic mobility as well as health. And it's important too that we study these educational outcomes because the grand challenges for social work talks about wanting to reduce extreme economic inequality, and education for youth with lived experiences in foster care is one of the ways that we can reduce that extreme economic inequality. And so literature talks about how those with higher education degrees are more likely to have a longer lifespan than those with some college experience and high school and non-high school graduates. So that's another benefit of post-secondary enrollment. And so, other themes that we found when we're looking at post-secondary enrollment within our review was that there were gender differences in enrollment. For example, one of our studies highlighted that female participants were more likely to enroll in post-secondary education than their male peers, which is similar to the current statistics in college enrollment. In recent years, we saw where enrollment among men in higher education decreased from 47% to 42%. And also, we saw some geographical differences that students from urban areas were more likely to enroll into higher education than those who were from rural areas. And this is also a common theme that's in the literature, particularly in higher education research. And so a 2023 study, I think it's from Well et al., talks about that there were disparities between urban and rural students, and the rural status predicted lower college enrollment, particularly at four-year institutions. And this could be due to the socioeconomic inequalities that exist in college access that exists between rural communities and non-rural communities. Another outcome, so one of the things too that I want to mention is when we started this project on the systematic review, we were focused solely on educational outcomes, but we noticed as we were going through the articles that many of these programs mentioned other outcomes outside of educational outcomes, such as academic preparedness and self-efficacy. And one of the things that we found was that it really increased their confidence to navigate higher education environments. And it could be due to the exposure, having them on college campuses, taking these college level courses, and showing them that it may not be as hard as what they thought. So, kind of demystifying the process of higher education. Also, it provided them a better understanding of the financial aid process, which is something that traditional pre-college programs emphasize, but it may not be as heavily emphasized as a program that is tailored for youth with lived experiences in foster care. And it also gave them a stronger sense of that college is for them. And it could be due to interacting with their peers who also had the motivation to pursue higher education, but also building out their support networks of youth who were already enrolled in college who had a similar background and that lived experience in foster care. And moving on to the psychosocial outcomes, there were two programs in our systematic review that focused on psychosocial programs. And one of those was the Fostering Higher Education Initiative, which combined substance use and sleep programming in their intervention. And this was particularly important and something that's admirable given the higher rates of substance abuse among collegiate populations. And then we also saw where the Better Futures program focused on supporting youth with mental health challenges. And this was an important strategy given that foster youth may experience higher rates of mental health disorders. And these are not just isolated clinical diagnosis, but pervasive conditions that directly undermine college persistence. In my work, I aim to reveal or highlight that behavioral health and academic outcomes should be viewed as synonymous and that they should not be separate. And so it's important that these pre-college programs focused on meeting the psychosocial needs of their participants. So, the key takeaway from our systematic review was that pre-college programs for foster youth are working in relation to short-term outcomes. So the studies included in our review had either between a 45 to 90% of in college enrollment rates across their program. One of the studies talked about compared to the 20% at baseline. And so they do this by consistent improvements in college preparedness, self-efficacy, and confidence that youth report feeling, and also their reports of talking about college is for me for the first time, and that these programs were also accomplishing this by building community with peers from similar backgrounds. One of the other things that we noticed that was a gap in our review was that despite higher enrollment, one of the papers, I believe it was by Courtney et al., talked about that only 8% of the participants went to earn college degrees. So that gives us the illumination that short-term gains may not translate into long-term degree attainment. And so pre-college programs are necessary, but they may not be sufficient enough just to answer that persistence question, but youth need sustained support through college, not just to college. And so, again, those program features talking about the duration, the peer mentorship, the campus exposure, the community building aspect, and the comprehensive support are important. But again, one of the limitations, we can't really say whether those features did work or not because there was no comparison group in many of these studies. And given that many of the participants in these studies were predominantly youth of color, which is reflective of the child welfare overrepresentation of youth of color, it's important that we see that they are being served by these pre-college programs. And the populations that were served by these pre-college programs were also high school age between ages 14 to 19, which is a critical age to instill higher education at. And then also, some of the studies talked about that their population were some transitioning into college. And many of the studies talked about how their participants were youth with multiple placements and limited support networks. But one of the challenges with that is that we could only suppose that there may be some selection bias concerns in the study because those who have participated in the program may have already had some motivation to attend higher education. And so, being mindful of time, there are some implications for research. Again, we need to do more longitudinal studies following pre-college participants through graduation. So, again, focusing on studying the 8% who do complete their degrees, what was different about them? Do pre-college programs connect youth to campus supports, which in turn aid in their persistence? Or is there a need for pre-college programs plus ongoing campus supports to aid in their success? And then also, we need to address that completion gap. And then lastly, to better understand which components work. One of the things that we talked about in our review that Dr. Jackson brought onto our study is that the Casey Family Foundation created this framework for supporting success and is used in many campus support programs. But we need the equivalent for pre-college programs that can kind of emphasize what are the core components of a successful pre-college program, provide evidence for implementation guidelines, for how do we evaluate success in these programs, modules for the different contexts of these programs, such as the program, I think it's the Fostering in Higher Education Initiative, they use modules, and then also having quality benchmarks to understand that the needs are being met. Our review reveals that we do have promising practices, but we do lack the evidence to confidently recommend specific program models to guide replication and scaling, and also to justify the major funding investment. And so to also understand why these programs work. So I wanted to spend some time here because we're at a very unique moment, and I'm glad that this webinar was held today because I think it was last week or either the week before last that President Trump signed an executive order calling for the reallocation of fund to return Chafee funds to promote educational success for youth transitioning out of foster care. So our systematic review kind of provides some evidence that pre-college programs can enhance college preparedness, attendance, and self efficacy. And these are the outcomes that the executive order is designed to support. And so we can do this by framing pre-college program expansions as a direct response to these federal priorities from the Trump administration. And programs should be integrated into this ecosystem as far as this fostering the future platform that he has. And another thing too is that our research found that many of the youth in these programs were from underrepresented backgrounds and also were racial minorities. And so research shows that HBCUs, along with other minority serving institutions, can facilitate academic achievement for students with lower academic preparation and lower SES. And this is particularly pronounced among HBCUs. And so this is exactly the profile that many foster youth entering into higher education are experiencing. And the community that is provided at HBCUs may nurture youth with lived experience in foster care and may aid in supporting their retention. And again, just moving on to the implications for practice, we can continue to employ foster care alumni as mentors and program staff, as we saw that that was one of the things in the qualitative studies that participants really enjoyed. And we should continue to design these programs that build affinity and community. And so being mindful of the time, saying, where do we go from here? That we should leverage this policy moment that we're in with the Trump administration, and particularly this fostering the future executive order to justify the investment in pre-college programs. But building upon this, I wanted it to open it up for a discussion. I think we have a few minutes on what other policy moments are we in now that we can use to be able to support educational transitions for youth with lived experiences in foster care. And please feel free to use the chat or to come off mute. I believe we can learn from just sharing all of our insights. Anyone have any suggestions with that? Okay, I see something in the chat. Give some people, just in case someone is typing.
And thanks so much for your presentation, Terrell. So everyone, feel free to type any questions that you have in the chat as well too, or come off of mute if you'd like to. Both in response to this question about, next steps regarding policy, but if there's kind of general comments or thoughts from during the presentation as well, feel free to comment or ask questions. One thing that struck me in particular, Terrell, as we're waiting for people are thinking, is around implementation support, which you did address in talking about some of the implications of this work. And I feel like that is one of, it's a considerable challenge. Like how do you take these programs that have shown some evidence of success and actually implement them into community programming, and who's going to deliver those, depending on geographic locations that may or may not have like more or less resources for things. So I didn't know if you could say any bit more about like what you might have seen as far as programs that seem like, these could be feasibly implemented without like a high amount of resources or whatnot. I know that's beyond the scope of what you were looking at specifically, but if you had any sense in that as you were looking at programs.
Yeah, so in our review, we saw where like there were some programs that didn't use like a specific framework. It just kind of focused, I think it was the Washington program that used the case managers, and it was more so like individual level, a case manager working with the participant to talk about like walking them through the FAFSA process, getting them signed up for the tuition waiver, helping them apply for college. And I think that is a very simple thing, especially when we're looking at maybe there may be a lack of resources. It's just focusing on this, the individual level, and maybe providing like that direct micro support to the individual. And I saw something here in the chat that it says there are policy moments happening at the state level in Virginia. So would say state and local initiatives are important too, not just federal policy moments. I work in Virginia, so that's what I'm most focused on right now. That's a really good perspective. Thank you. I see someone's hand up. Nate.
All right, thanks, Terrell. Thanks for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. You're definitely a natural. Um, I had two questions. One that's more about the research. Another one that's more about, I guess, like the actual program, like components. Um, so I guess I'll start with the program component part. You mentioned in your review that some of the programs had a residential component, like over the summer residential component. Some cases it was a few days. Other programs they had it for longer, about a month or so. Um, I've done some work evaluating a bridge program like this that had a residential component, and by far it was the most expensive part of the program. Which running the summer program, um, students it was valuable to the students, right? Just to live on campus, to take in this case they were able to take some classes, get a sense of like walking in the shoes of a college student. But on the other hand, it was very expensive. There's a lot of logistical issues that came up, a lot of liability things, things that make it hard. I don't know, just based on your experience, what would you say about just the importance of a residential component to a program?
Yeah, so I think within the studies that we included within those with the residential component, I believe that that was one of the those studies talked about that exposed them to higher education and kind of really demystified the process associated with going to higher education versus those programs that were just happening in the community and telling them about higher education. And one of the things that you talked about is the funding aspect to that. Many of the programs that were held on the college campus that included them staying on campus, I think one study in particular, and I can follow up with you when I find out which one it is that they received foundation support from the institution, and that kind of alleviated some of the costs for paying for the residence hall and those meals that they provided to the participants. So I would say the biggest thing about the residential program, it just gives them the opportunity to demystify just this whole higher education process, but it also provides them some exposure to just the higher education environment as well.
Hmm. Yeah, it's critical. I mean, even just like taking a tour of a college, totally different than just talking about this abstract thing, going to college. So the second question, I think this comes from the finding that, I mean, there's half dozen studies that, looked at these programs. Some of them didn't even have a comparison group. So there really is a need for more rigorous research. Doing good quality studies takes a lot of money, a lot of time. Do you have any suggestions about, directions for future research that's feasible, that could really, yeah.
Yeah, so on this slide here, let me go back here. Give me one second to save. So one of the things that we focused on and we talked about amongst ourselves when we were thinking about future research is thinking about like what are the supports that may be needed within once they're enrolled in higher education to support those gains in higher education. And then also how do you bridge those pre-college programs with campus support programs to kind of aid in that success to higher education? Another research question that I know that we talked about amongst ourselves was what role should these pre-college programs play post-enrollment? So even though many of these programs are kind of like the one and done, that once they enroll and or complete the program, they're just going to college, but continuing to provide that ongoing support and trying to identify what support systems that they may need once they're enrolled into higher education. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah, and that's I think a big part of it too is like getting that comparison group when we're trying
Yeah.
to do an evaluation. So even I know some folks have been starting to do this already, but working with the state child welfare department to get a sample of young people that were in foster care around the same time, didn't participate in the program, and then getting as much information as you could about these young people that didn't enroll to try to like balance them out, see where their differences are, and then adjust for them statistically to get a more accurate estimate of the impact.
Yeah, that's a good perspective. Thank you.
Yep.
And it's nice to
Yeah,
meet you. We cited you in our paper.
good to meet you too.
I think I saw something in the chat. In Georgia, we have held pre-collegiate programs for youth in care since 2011. One challenge has been attributing enrollment to a short program. Very challenging. Yeah. That's one thing, again, that I mentioned in the presentation that we notice is that they kind of provide these short-term gains, but not really these supporting these long-term outcomes. Well, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Jenna. And if you have any more questions, please feel free to email me or connect with me on LinkedIn. Happy to talk more about this work and how we can collaborate to move this research forward.
Yeah, thank you, Terrell. There are a couple more comments too I'm seeing here in the chat, and I'll just highlight too for uh, just the purpose of people being able to look up. There's one comment about potential at the state level through the Legal Center for Foster Care and Education recently released new state legislation resources, um, and some higher education recommendations tie into this work. One of the questions here was, are these peer or former foster alumni provided training before they begin work with other foster youth? Um, Wondering if some of these programs want the expertise of someone with lived experience, but treat them differently than other employees.
Yeah, so in our review, particularly in one of the articles, they highlighted, I don't remember which particular study it was, but they highlighted how before they started the program that the youth with lived experience in foster care who were going to serve as these peer mentors kind of went through this rigorous training on how to support the students, appropriate boundaries with the students, how to provide that coaching. And that is what aided in the success of kind of that peer coaching model between the youth with lived experience who are already enrolled in college versus the participants.
Thank you for that. One other question here was just wanting to know how can we find more information, including program specifics about the various programs you mentioned. They'd be interested to see a 3-day program versus a 2-week program and how time is prioritized.
Yeah, so if you email me, I'm happy to share our systematic review with you. And we have a table there that kind of locates where you can find the report or the article, and that can give you more information about those specific program specifics.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, I really appreciate your presentation today. Um, it was great to hear about the work that you've been doing, and I appreciate everyone in the audience for joining us today, and hope to see you all again soon.